And we are live. So this is Raw Sport Weekly, a news show from the Raw Sport department. For those who don't know, I'm your head of department, Josh Sim. And this is, as I said, this is a new show. Raw Sport Weekly is for sports news across the spectrum of sports. This will be every odd week, so a fortnightly show. So this week, week 3, and so on. It will kind of in and out with our interviews that we started last term and that we're hopefully going to continue throughout the course of this term. So on the agenda, as you can see in the video title, we are going to talk about the NFL in a bit, and we're going to preview the Eifel Grand Prix in Germany in the last half hour. But to kick it all off, we are going to talk about the NBA finals that have really captured the imagination of American sport at the moment, and I am joined by, as I was last week, with fellow Raw exec Jacob X1. How are you?
Well, I'm good, thank you, Josh. How are you?
I'm very good, thanks. Apologies, I should say off the top to any viewers. I've just been playing sport and literally made it back just in the nick of time. So if I sound like I'm having heavy breathing or that would be me. So apologies in advance. But anyway, we'll talk about the NBA Finals. We had Game 4 last night. The Lakers won 102 to the Miami Heat's 96, and that means the Lakers have a 3-1 lead in the best-of-7 series. Star performers, obviously LeBron James at 28 points, 12 rebounds, 8 assists, and he was well complemented by Anthony Davis, who had 22 points, 9 rebounds, and then 4 assists and blocks apiece. And as well as Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who hit 15 points as well for the Heat. And I'm just rattling this off for people who don't know. For the Heat, Jimmy Butler, 22 points, 10 rebounds, 9 assists, 3 steals, a well-rounded performance as usual. Tyler Hero had 21 points and 7 boards. He made 3 of 7 from the three-point line. Duncan Robinson chipped in with 17 points. Right, so with that all out the way, X1, I mean, you followed it closely this series, and Miami, for those who don't know, took Game 3 and really it was a bit of a statement win because they were missing 2 key players in Bam Adebayo and Goran Dragic, and Jimmy Butler really carried them, as the video title suggests. He bit back. So now with the Lakers taking last night's game, do you think this was an important game for the Lakers to kind of reassert control of the series before, losing? Because you and I both know in the NBA, one loss can lead to many quite easily in the series. So how important was this win for the Lakers?
100%. This win was really the regroup the Lakers needed, because if we look at Game 3, where the Lakers were coming in hot, two games won, they were looking at the possibility of a sweep. But it proved that the Heat aren't the team where they can just finesse. The Heat proved that they're a dog-eat-dog team where they're playing hard. If we look at Jimmy Butler in that game, he scored 40 points. Like, the Heat aren't a team where the Lakers can just finesse them. So this game was absolutely necessary to return that confidence, return that Laker, I don't want to call it arrogance, but that Laker energy where we are the Lakers, we can dominate and we can do well. And that's what LeBron James put out in this game.
Yeah, and pre-game, I think it was post-game, LeBron said this was one of the biggest wins of he called it one of the biggest wins of his career. For those who follow NBA closely, for those who don't follow the NBA closely, LeBron James is, chasing rings to elevate himself into that same level as a Michael Jordan. So personally, this obviously took a lot of significance for him. Anthony Davis came under a lot of criticism for Game 3 because he didn't really, he had lit up Game 2, and then Game 3, he kind of came into a shell of himself. So as well as LeBron coming out big, what was the significance of Anthony Davis coming out to play as he did last night? And, again, being that Robin to LeBron's Batman, to help them overcome a Miami Heat team who would have been high on confidence coming into this game.
I think you really captured that really well, that Anthony Davis has to be the Robin. If we look at game 3, where the Heat were able to dominate a bit, he wasn't that Robin there. He wasn't as present, but Anthony Davis came back. He showed like he took a heavy fall early on in the game. Yeah, I believe he fell over Alex Caruso. For the first few seconds I saw that, I was concerned. I was thinking, is AD seriously injured? But luckily he was back quite soon. So he took that opportunity to really prove to LeBron in this game we've just seen in game 4 that I've got your back. I'm not going to shy away again. And I'm going to get knocked down, but I'm coming fighting for you, because LeBron is battling with Father Time here, which Anthony Davis is still a somewhat young player. He's got years ahead in the league. Whereas LeBron, his years are, you can count them maybe on one hand, two hands, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at the support cast, and I appreciate we've now got, after last week, Freshers Week, we had a limited time we could talk about it. Now we've got a bit more time. You look at the supporting cast, and I mentioned Caldwell Pope hitting 15 points. He had 5 points in game 3. And in game 1 and 2, he didn't really impact the scoreboard as much as Lakers fans would have hoped. And suddenly it's been funny for me as a non-Lakers fan to see the name Danny Green trending on Twitter, because he also has not hit any of his shots, and a lot of angry Lakers fans have been tweeting at him. We just talked about LeBron, we talked about Anthony Davis individually, but the supporting cast have to step up as well, don't they, in order to carry those guys through when they're taking a breather, because finals basketball can take quite a toll on your body. And so again, those guys stepping up must have been huge for them last night.
100%, especially looking at these guys. The guys that come to mind more recently are Rajon Rondo. His plays in game 4, like, Rondo was a highly regarded player back in the day. He was on a Celtics championship running team, and Rondo I think he's taken that, not exactly leader role, but number 2, sort of the guy who people talk to, people look to. I saw an interview where he was talking about how he spoke to LeBron about body language, and how some of these young players really look up to him. And Rondo has taken that time to really guide LeBron and guide other players. We're looking at the likes of, okay, maybe not as much impact, but Kyle Kuzma. We're looking at the likes of, as mentioned, Danny Green. The younger players, particularly this this young thing, they're looking to really elevate them, because this is who LeBron is building around, not just for this one championship who he hopes to win, but 2, if not 3 more.
Yeah, and arguably this is the best time for LeBron to win. As you say, he is getting older, and we have no idea what the future holds in terms of injuries and so on, as we saw with the end of Kobe Bryant's career as well. So moving on to the other side, Miami Heat. They obviously big win, game 3, as we said. Jimmy Butler has been nothing but stellar in this series. And it looks like Tyler Hero's also finding his groove. Duncan Robinson's also finding his groove. So the supporting cast is starting to elevate their game. But last night, what stood out to me in terms of the stats, they only hit 11 3-pointers, 34%. And we know the Heat are a very good 3-point shooting team overall. But last night, do you reckon it was the case that just the shots weren't falling that day, or do you see that there needs to be a change in their strategy ahead of a do or die situation in game 5?
I reckon, looking at it, game 4, we saw the return of Bam Adebayo. It was the Heat possibly winning 2, possibly winning 3, something where the Heat could possibly take the advantage, put the Lakers in a lower position. But I don't know if it's from a coaching standpoint. I don't know what the team tactic is. I could see them pushing the Lakers more in the paint, trying to get more steals. They're really trying to get aggressive with the Lakers. I keep on calling the Heat a dog team, and I could see that in game 4 particularly, where they're really pushing the Lakers into the paint and trying to take away the threes, because the Lakers have been doing very well on the 3-pointers, and it shows where if the Lakers are allowed to shoot threes, if you're seeing LeBron being allowed to have 3 seconds to have like a nice adjustment to get his shot up, their team tactics seem to have changed slightly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll wait to see if they can get those 3-point shooting boots on. And obviously, it's funny how you mentioned the Lakers have been doing well at 3-point shooting. That was the concern, I think, coming into this series, coming into the bubble, really, because we weren't sure at the shooting, and then they added J.R. Smith, Dion Waiters to do exactly that. And those guys have barely played, and somehow they've found their groove, which has been pretty impressive. Is there anything else you're looking forward to or expecting ahead of Game 5? And I should ask, I guess, are you sticking to your prediction that the Heat are going to come back to win the series?
Looking at what I've seen and looking at the way the Lakers are playing, I still do see a possibility of the Heat coming back, at least winning Game 5, pushing it to a Game 6 possibly. It all depends on the coaching and tactics standpoint, because if you look at the Heat, Jimmy Butler can score, he can distribute. He had a triple-double in Game 3, so it's not a question of is Jimmy Butler good enough to lead the team. It's will the team rally around Jimmy Butler. I know it has the likes of Iguodala and other championship runners, but I'm looking at Jimmy Butler as their center player, and they need to rally around him, push him for the points, because he's not the tallest. He's not the tallest player. I think he stands at 6'3", but he can go into the paint and he can bully the likes of LeBron and Anthony Davis, 6'9", 6'11" guys. So it's a question of will the Heat rally around Jimmy Butler and allow him to really be their center player and distribute when necessary.
Yeah, it will come down to that for sure, for him to be able to facilitate those teammates and get those open looks and those 3-point shots. Absolutely. And so very interesting. We will see what happens Game 5, whether the Lakers, as we mentioned, it's a best of 7. So the Lakers, if they win the next game, it is all over. So it is, for those who don't know, it is do or die for Miami. Moving off the court, there's been a bit of a coaching merry-go-round, one could say. There are, to my knowledge, there are 5 jobs vacant. 4 have been filled recently. So it's been very busy. When you think about 30 teams, it's nearly a third of the league. So plenty of change. The big one, I guess, is the 76ers have signed Doc Rivers merely just days after he left the LA Clippers. For those who don't know, Doc Rivers is a legendary coach. Obviously, with the Boston Celtics, had a very, very successful run there. It didn't quite work out with the Clippers, although it has to be said this was his first season with the likes of Paul George and Kawhi. So maybe do you reckon he was hard done by, I guess, as a first question? Do you think it was unfair for him to be dismissed by the Clippers so soon?
See, looking at the Clippers as a team, it's this time, I think roughly last year, where people are saying, oh, the Clippers are good. LA is now the Clippers city. Kawhi Leonard had just won a championship with the Raptors. They were bringing in Paul George. It looks like they're really rallying around the team, and they're going to pick a coach that fits. If we contrast it back a couple of years ago, when the Lakers didn't have Frank Vogel, the Lakers brought in a coach that would fit around the star players. And I see that the Clippers are doing the same, whereby they're going to hopefully bring in a coach that fits with Paul George and fits with Kawhi Leonard, because I don't know what it is. Maybe there was an issue in the locker room. Was Doc Rivers hard done by? Possibly. But I think looking at the way the Lakers have been able to finesse essentially the league with 2 star players, I think the Clippers want to build around their star players, and then management and etc. fit around that, as opposed to it being the other way around.
Yeah, I guess in any sports, the manager, and I know Joe's on the sidelines, Joe will agree, the manager or the team person in charge is the one who loses their job first. That's just how professional sports seems to go. And he's ended up at the Sixers. And what did you think of that move? Because that is, to me, and it feels like sort of Boston Celtics mini me, I guess, because you got Embiid, who could maybe play the Kevin Garnett role. You have Ben Simmons, who could play the Rondo role as well, of Rondo of the Celtics era. And Tobias Harris could play the Paul Pierce role. Do you see it like me? Do you think he's got a very good chance of making it work in Philadelphia?
I think Philadelphia is the best position for him to be in because one, they look like a very like capable team, but they're a very young team. They can take lots of guidance. Ben Simmons has been under LeBron's wing for a couple of years now. People were seeing him early on as LeBron's successor. Ben Simmons would possibly, if he develops that 3-point shot, could be the next LeBron-esque player. And particularly Joel Embiid, a 7-footer who can shoot the three, who can dominate in the paint, and if necessary, play the point guard role if they so require. So it's a fantastic position for him to be in because he's got this young team where already the talent is there. They just need that shaping. They just need that precision now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating appointment, and I'm very excited. I think that's the one that caught the eye. Obviously, there's been a flurry of appointments. You've seen Billy Donovan go to the Chicago Bulls, who left the Thunder. The Thunder job remains vacant. Steve Nash went to Brooklyn, which is a very interesting one. He's a first-year coach, obviously legendary player. Also appears on North America's football coverage as well, for those who maybe watched that. And then Tom Thibodeau going to the Knicks, who have struggled for a long time, to put it gently. And then, we still have 5 jobs left: Pelicans, Rockets, the Clippers, where we just said, Pacers, and the Thunder. Ty Lue, one of the standout candidates, has met with the Pelicans and the Clippers. He's set to meet with the Rockets at some point. I'll just list those jobs again that are vacant: the Pelicans, Rockets, Clippers, Pacers, and the Thunder. Which job would you gravitate towards if you were a head coach candidate? Like, which, I mean, it might be an obvious question because the Clippers are probably the best team ready to contend. But yeah, so which team would you kind of lean towards if they were to seek you out for a coaching opportunity?
Well, looking at it, I think especially now we're looking at longevity in the league because we're competing with LeBron James's Lakers, who are looking to be dominating for the next 3-4 years. So we're looking for a team that hopefully can be in the finals, or if not, the conference finals for the next couple of years, and a team that can develop. So the ones that stand out to me personally would be the Pelicans and also Indiana. Although Indiana do look to be in a rebuilding phase, they have a young core they can build around. And also looking at the Pelicans have the likes of the big name Zion Williamson, and surrounding him, we've got the likes of Brandon Ingram, Lonzo Ball, Josh Hart. The Pelicans are a team where they just need a year or 2 years of practice because talent-wise and ability-wise, it's there. So those two teams, Indiana and the Pelicans, those are teams which I see, not now, of course, but maybe in a year, 2 years, will be able to be that finals team, if not conference finals teams.
Yeah, as you mentioned, those are very good teams to watch out for, and it'll be interesting to see what direction they go in. That will, I guess, there's plenty of coaching stuff to keep an eye on, as we've said. So please, if you are a basketball fan, obviously you would keep an eye on that. But for the non-basketball fans, do just keep an eye. It will be with possibly a third of the league under new management. It'll be an exciting season. When we get that season, of course, we think it'll be January 2021 at the latest. So fingers crossed. Jacob, thanks for coming on to chat NBA as always. And maybe in 2 weeks' time, we'll be chatting about the season as a whole and the final season, provided it finishes in the next 2 weeks, which is pretty likely, I'd say.
I'm hoping for a Game 7, but thank you very much for having me on this week.
Of course, we love having you here. So that is Jacob X1 talking about the NBA. Jacob, thanks so much. And we are now going to transition. We're going to stay in North America, but we're going to move to the NFL. Do drop us a comment. I know this is slightly, the organization hasn't been as fine-tuned as we'd like, but do comment. Let us know what you think about all this news, and we're bringing in someone who's more organized than me, or I'd like to think so. It's Joe Spagnoli.
More organized than you, Josh. I've been awake for less than half an hour.
Yeah, and I've had to kind of trek across Leamington for the last 10 minutes, pace walking in a bid to get here on time, which I did. So, but it's not the finest of organization skills by any means. We are going to talk about the NFL because there's been plenty going on. We'll start with the COVID-19, which has obviously affected a lot of sports, and it seems to have hit the NFL hard. We've seen the Tennessee Titans have had lots of positive cases. I don't really know the exact numbers because it seems to be changing every day, so I don't want to speculate. But bottom line is they've been hit hard. Their game with the Pittsburgh Steelers was postponed and then called off and then has been rescheduled for later in the season. We also had Cam Newton had a positive case, which forced the Patriots-Chiefs game to be pushed back a couple of days, and also forced the Patriots to play Brian Hoyer as their quarterback for 3 quarters before Jarrett Stidham came in. But anyways, would you, as someone who watches the NFL a bit, would you be worried that COVID is starting to have a knock-on effect on the NFL, or is it because it's early on in the season, there's still time to kind of, adjust and, adjust with the circumstances as they go?
Honestly, this kind of timing of the season, week 4, a couple of weeks after these cases, what with the 2-week incubation period of COVID-19 would have the chance to proliferate. It's pretty worrying that this early in the season we're already seeing this many cases, and localized as well. We know of at least 3 teams who've been affected by this. The Kansas City Chiefs played, I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but one of the teams affected this weekend. We haven't got testing figures of them, so that could very quickly rise to 4 teams affected by it. I believe, further to your comment, the Tennessee Titans have, and it's difficult to know how many of these are players versus coaching staff, around 10 positive cases of COVID-19. And if I may take us back to when it began to rock the football world earlier this year, people really started to take notice of COVID-19 when star players were affected. I think Paulo Dybala for Juventus, when he got tested positive after about 4 other Juventus teammates, people really started to take notice of it. The same is happening in the NFL. You've already mentioned Cam Newton, of course, star quarterback for the New England Patriots. Stephon Gilmore, by far their best defensive player, this cornerback, formerly of the Buffalo Bills, he, as of 2 hours ago, has tested positive for COVID-19. So these are 2 superstar players, superstar level players for the New England Patriots. If people weren't taking attention to this beforehand, they certainly will be now. It's being described as an outbreak on the New York Post. I'm just going to have a look at 2 Titans players tested positive for coronavirus on Wednesday after 2 days of negative test results. So again, that's the incubation period coming in. Tennessee was going to reopen its facilities on Wednesday, but that plan has obviously been halted as a result of this. No Chiefs players have tested positive yet. But, it seems like there's a lack of control in the NFL as well, as 10 Las Vegas Raiders players were fined on Monday after attending a charity event hosted by tight end Darren Waller. We don't know which Las Vegas Raiders player has tested positive as of yet, but we know of certainly 1 case. It seems like early in the season, the NFL is very quickly losing control over COVID-19.
Yeah, and it goes to show the differences in strategy, because we talked about the NBA just now. They are in a bubble environment, and so was the NHL. And as we talked about with Luke James last week, it has worked out tremendously well. Whereas baseball and the NFL have elected to play as they are, play as normally, and these are knock-on effects. So I guess this is something that I'm sure that they probably knew could happen, and we will wait to see how it affects the season in terms of how long the season is and so forth. The other major news off the field rather was the Houston Texans dismissed Bill O'Brien, who has led the team to a 0-4 record this season, which is not great by any standards. Other significant moves they made in the summer: they traded away star wide receiver DeAndre Hopkins to the Cardinals, and that took away a significant weapon for their team. And you also look at, they have no first or second round draft picks for the next year's draft. They belong to the Miami Dolphins. So
obviously, every first and second round draft pick belongs to the Miami Dolphins these days.
Well, they are a rebuilding team. But when you hear me read those issues, there's issues in terms of their on-field performance. There's issues with their roster because they traded away a star player, which is always a risky move, and they got rid of players that could have made an impact next year. So it's hard not to be bleak about the Houston Texans. Is it? Like, is there any positivity you can take from where their current situation, where they're currently mired in?
Star player does not come close to describing just how important DeAndre Hopkins was to that team. The quarterback Deshaun Watson, ever since that trade happened, has been vocally and clearly furious at Bill O'Brien for trading away one of the best, I'll say it right now, probably top 5 wide receivers in the entire league, away to a team that, granted, aren't division rivals or anything, but the Arizona Cardinals rebuilding, of course, first overall draft pick from a couple of years ago, Kyler Murray at quarterback. He's now got one of the best receivers in the league to throw to. The trade made absolutely no sense at the time. It was one of the biggest. I mean, if Tom Brady hadn't joined the Buccaneers about 2 days later, we would all have been talking about this trade as one of the biggest in all of sport this summer. As for Bill O'Brien, I've been looking at his record throughout the day. When the Texans have won the AFC South over the course of his 7-year career, the first 2 times they had a 9-7 record, barely making it over 500, despite being division winners. AFC South very, very poor throughout this decade in general. The best that they got was 11-5 back in 2018. But again, they lost to the Indianapolis Colts in the wild card game. So it's not like under Bill O'Brien, when they won the AFC South, the Texans weren't really getting far into the playoffs anyway. Consider the significant damage made to the roster this offseason with the loss of DeAndre Hopkins, the clear discontent with the quarterback and the defensive players in particular, and reports about Bill O'Brien's personality off the pitch. It seemed almost inevitable, and a 4-0 start in a division like that, it's unforgivable.
Yeah, it's a tough start. I mean, it's a tough start for them, and he's paid the price for some decisions. Obviously, we should also mention he acted as the GM of that franchise, and so had a very hands-on role when it came to roster construction. And so
it's like Ralph Rangnick, but incompetent in every single way.
Oh, they're not in the same ballpark, please. They're not in the same ballpark. But anyway, so that has happened. There's been no talk of a replacement. Obviously, there's an interim coach at the moment, but again, we will obviously discuss the coaching appointment if there is one to be made. Let's talk a bit we'll touch briefly upon last week's results. I think I've got 2 of the significant ones here that I wanted to talk about. The first one, for those who don't follow NFL, it's a very high scoreline. The Dallas Cowboys 38 lost to the Cleveland Browns 49. It's not a great start for so-called America's favorite team, the Dallas Cowboys. They are 1-3 despite Dak Prescott going for 500, throwing for over 500 yards, getting 5 touchdowns, and still they are 1-3 under Mike McCarthy. Should Cowboys fans be worried, Joe? Is this something that they should start panicking about?
In one half of the Dallas Cowboys' entire performance, defense, this is their worst start to a season ever. I've been reading articles about this just over the last half hour or so, and it's absolutely crazy. I mean, we didn't really see these defensive issues so much last year, so I don't think you can really attack their draft pick of CeeDee Lamb, wide receiver in the first round, so much when there were defensive players available. But just looking at the Dallas Cowboys' results so far this season, I'm going to find. I just want to get exact scores right now. So on open week, they lost 2017 against the LA Rams, which far the lowest amount of points they've conceded in the game, 20. They won by 1 point, 40-39 over the Atlanta Falcons, who by all accounts have had a pretty bad start to the season. Then they, against a defensive powerhouse in the Seattle Seahawks, they conceded 38 points in a loss. And then against the Cleveland Browns, a legacy of failure, a team that are only now really beginning to look like the team they should have for the last 5 years, quarterbacked by Baker Mayfield, they conceded 49 points. The average points conceded is somewhere in the region of 36 points projected per game throughout this season. Their worst ever season defensively, the Dallas Cowboys, America's biggest team, is around 27.4 points a game. That is a massive discrepancy from the worst ever, and this season gets even worse than that. The amount of optimism going into the season, you know, Dak Prescott franchise tagged, looking like he could enter the top echelon of quarterbacks in this league. Ezekiel Elliott, unquestionably one of the best running backs in the world, and adding offensive weapons like CeeDee Lamb. But it feels like the optimism was on offense, and they're really starting to pay for it now. Despite this being a division where, you know, my New York Giants have been resolutely screwed by the injury to Saquon Barkley, even now the Cowboys look massively off the pace relative to the Eagles and the Washington football team.
Yeah, it's that division as in particular looks pretty rough at the moment, and the team leading that division coincidentally is the Philadelphia Eagles, who got their first win against the injury hit San Francisco 49ers. Obviously, no Jimmy Garoppolo. They're hoping he comes back for the next game or was within the ballpark of the next 2 weeks or so. But Carson Wentz was struggling coming into this game. He had the lowest pass rating of all quarterbacks coming into the game. He had the most turnovers. It feels like this win, maybe it's a turning point, maybe not, but it's a significant win nonetheless for Philadelphia.
Yeah, and in what could be possibly the most dossy division win throughout the year, we're talking about a division where projected right now they don't even need to be above 400, like 40% of wins this season to potentially win the division by some amount. I think the Philadelphia Eagles were probably favourites to make the playoffs anyway, I dare say, looking at the incompletions in the Dallas Cowboys team, knowing how run dependent the New York Giants were, which the injury to Saquon Barkley has basically wiped out completely. And of course, Washington with all the off-field controversy there, and being a team in a clear phase of rebuild after a second overall pick last year. I think the Eagles look like the favourites anyway, but they have not had a good start to the season by any means. I'm optimistic that Carson Wentz can pull it together. This is a team that has actually a pretty high completion percentage to its receivers, so I'm assuming that's going to come up in the weeks to come. But a 1-2-1 record to start the season, I just can't believe that is a division lead. That's just mental. Yeah. The NFC East could be comfortably the worst division in the NFL this year.
Yes, it definitely looks that way at the moment, and we shall see how the rest of the season goes on. I mean, other than that, you had star performances this weekend from the likes of Russell Wilson, who Jack South and I talked about last week. He's looked electric so far. Aaron Rodgers looks quite back to his best. I read somewhere he recently was quoted to say that when he has a down year, other quarterbacks have a career year, as if to say, you know, I'm still very good at my very best, and he's backing it up. He's backing up with his performances. Tom Brady also had a very solid performance for the Buccaneers as well. Was there any standout results besides the two we've already mentioned? Was there anything that stood out to you from this week?
Just going to look through the fixtures right now because I don't remember absolutely all of them. Despite them looking pretty impressive at the start of the season, it was interesting to see the Kansas City Chiefs basically walk over the Patriots. Obviously, the Cam Newton quarterback issue would have had something to do with that, but 26-10, another fantastic win for the Kansas City Chiefs, who I've got down to win the Super Bowl yet again after retaining Patrick Mahomes. The Arizona Cardinals losing 21-31 against the Carolina Panthers, who we thought were looking like potentially the weakest team in the NFC South. That's a good result for them. Get their season off to a good run, maybe even in playoff contention. One thing, I mean, granted, we did see a fantastic performance from Russell Wilson, and I completely agree with you. I mean, I used to be a Seahawks fan, and he was just... I was more of a running back guy. I love Marshawn Lynch, but Russell Wilson has been consistently impressive and consistently consistent since the start of his career. And it's almost single-handedly down to him that Seattle are an impressive offensive team as well as defensive team. But even so, against a team that was so bad last year in the Miami Dolphins, they conceded 23 points. I feel like this Miami Dolphins football team is beginning to improve quite an awful lot. Obviously, they had about 60 million draft picks going into this year, and it sounds like it's going to be a similar story this coming off season as well. But no, positive signs coming out of Miami. We'll wait to see if that actually translates to any wins throughout the season. But yeah, some interesting results this weekend, and good to see that some of the hype for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers paid off. 38-31 versus the LA Chargers. Muted, Josh.
as usual. There we go. I'm allowed one a show. I think I'm allowed one a show.
It's very much becoming like a drinking game at this point. Josh mutes himself. I rant for over 2 minutes. Shots.
There we go. What I was going to say about the Miami Dolphins was it appears that Ryan Fitzpatrick has been doing very well, and it looks like we're going to have to wait a while to see Tua. Do you know how to pronounce the last name?
Tagovailoa.
There you go. We're going to wait a while to see him in action, it seems, from their good form.
That's a good thing for him, though, just to interject. Like, Tua had a massive injury last year, off-season, like the medical risks of drafting players when you literally could not go and conduct medicals on the players. Miami, despite Tua's quite clear talent, he could have won the Heisman Trophy last year had he not received that injury. But, you know, with Ryan Fitzpatrick doing so well, I think it's a good thing for Tua to wait. We often see this with players in all sport. I was about to say football, but players in all sport. If you've got competition in that spot, it's a luxury to be able to give players time to recover. You know, and getting Tua Tagovailoa in on that Miami Dolphins scheme, whatever the Miami Dolphins scheme of playing is after the last few years, that can only be seen as a positive. They kept Ryan Fitzpatrick for a reason. All power to him. Good start to the season, and I'm just hoping that Tua can live up to some of his potential later on.
Yeah, and the other, I mean, while Tua sits on the sidelines, two of the quarterbacks that were picked up in the first round of this year's draft have got off to a great start: Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert, who are
Herbert's impressed.
He's done very well.
All the doom that myself and another Raw alumni, Ed Farrow, were pulling on him, he's done pretty damn well at the start of the season.
Yeah, well, I'd be very surprised if Anthony Lynn gives the starting job back to Tyrod Taylor after this, because he's looked very good. Switching it over to something that's near and dear to your heart, and that is Formula One. We have the Eifel Grand Prix ahead this weekend in Nürburgring in Germany. A track the F1 calendar has not visited for a while, for several years, since it shared the German Grand Prix with Hockenheim. So, I mean, talking about the track, because there's been a lot of turnover in terms of drivers since we last were in Nürburgring. Does that do we expect any does that kind of raise the anticipation for a surprise result? Does it throw up an unknown that maybe other tracks we've seen haven't got, because some of these drivers have not driven there at F1 level unless they were the likes of Lewis Hamilton or so, who were around for then?
I mean, it is an interesting point. And obviously, Valtteri Bottas and Lewis Hamilton, the two Mercedes drivers who we can assume will be fighting for a win this weekend, were both around in 2013 when the Nürburgring was last on the calendar. The biggest changeover for me isn't going to be in terms of the drivers, because a lot of them will have done either junior formula driving at the Nürburgring or extensive work in the simulator. So they will know the Nürburgring, and also it's the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit. It's one of the most well-known F1 circuits in the world. I still think it's a disgrace that it's not on the calendar every year. Even if you've got Hockenheim, just call it the Luxembourg Grand Prix, like they did in, I think, 1997. Doesn't matter, whatever the case. The biggest change going into this is going to be the cars. These are the fastest F1 cars we've ever seen. This season, we have seen lap record after lap record broken. Even like the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, we saw that lap record come crashing down. The last time we raced at the Nürburgring was during the dying embers of the V8 era in 2013. The lap record for the Nürburgring GP circuit is from 2004. Michael Schumacher's Ferrari F2004, back when F1 cars were powered by V10s. It's around a 124 lap time. This is going to come down by several seconds this year. We are definitely going to get a new lap record. Can't wait to see who it's going to be. I suspect it's going to be one of the Mercedes. But that's the real difference. These cars are a lot wider. They're a lot faster. Is the Nürburgring, which isn't a wide track by any means, going to be able to facilitate 20 of these V6 hybrid monsters on the grid this year?
Yeah, and you look at the track layout. There's a lot of cornering. There's a lot of obviously opportunities for overtaking, but then cornering does favor the likes of Red Bull, the likes of the midfield cars who maybe wouldn't have the outright speed to catch up to the likes of Mercedes. So with that in mind, do you feel like we might have another result other than a Mercedes win, or is it still is it still kind of assumed that we're going to see one of Hamilton or Bottas topping that podium come Sunday afternoon?
You know what, Josh? I think the Nürburgring is actually more suited to Mercedes than an awful lot of these cars. A lot of the midfield runners, I say midfield runners, Red Bull are obviously the closest competition to Mercedes at the moment. And they have a significant aerodynamic imbalance in their car. At some tracks, like, for example, Monaco, if we were racing there, that wouldn't really matter so much. But a lot of the corners at the Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit are high speed or medium speed bends with extensive camber or significant elevation changes. When the G-forces are changing that much through a corner, that is going to really test the mechanical and aero grip of those cars. I can see a couple of Red Bull spins, especially from Alexander Albon in practice. The Mercedes looks a lot more planted. We associate the Red Bull with having a superior chassis and mechanical grip over the Mercedes. That may still be the case, but the car is so unbalanced, relatively speaking. I actually think the Mercedes is going to have a bigger advantage than at most of the tracks this year at the Nürburgring. Not to mention the fact, not to oversimplify, Mercedes is a German team, apart from the fact they're based in the UK. This racetrack is in Germany. 1 + 1 = 2.
Yeah, it will. I mean, it will. It obviously makes sense that you'd be very bold to bet against a Mercedes winning the Grand Prix on Sunday. But you mentioned obviously the Mercedes. You feel like will have a strength at Nürburgring. What about the other Mercedes-powered cars? We look at the likes of McLaren. We look at the likes of Racing Point. Do we expect them maybe to put up a fight for maybe not a podium spot, but certainly 4th, 5th, 6th, up there at least?
Well, McLaren are still powered by Renault, but honestly, the power unit advantages, with the exception of whatever the hell's going on at Ferrari, doesn't mean as much this year. Renault look pretty damn competitive. The Honda power unit, which we're going to lose at the end of next year, lol Red Bull, they're not so far behind Mercedes anymore. It's somewhere between 0.5 seconds and 0.6, about where it was last year. So, I mean, the other Mercedes-powered cars, obviously the Racing Point, which looks pretty damn good, like 4th or 5th fastest car on the grid. That I'm assuming they're going to do well, especially considering since it's basically a copy of last year's Mercedes, it will have the aerodynamic grip to compensate with some of these tricky corners. As for Williams, they're just so far down the grid. Obviously, they're not going to be in contention for points with George Russell and Nicholas Latifi. But I can definitely see Renault doing well this weekend, actually. They're in really good form at the moment. They had a fantastic weekend at Mugello. Same could be said at the Russian Grand Prix as well, if you were able to stay awake throughout watching it, which I was not. They're quick through the corners. They're good in a straight line as well, despite having that Renault power. Ricciardo's in great form. I can see Renault doing very well this weekend. Not out of the question, if anything was to happen to Mercedes or Red Bull, Ricciardo could get on the podium.
That was it. I think I mistook Williams and McLaren. I think I mixed those ones.
McLaren, in fairness, McLaren are going to Mercedes next year.
That's it. That's why it was momentarily slipped there. But so it should be hopefully an interesting race then, and certainly certainly maybe not the top 2 of the drivers' standings. Those maybe not the top 2 occupying the driver's standings at the moment. Certainly 3 on down to. I mean, we know it goes down to 6, but there's certainly a host of drivers that could be fighting for points. Is there a particular driver you want to spotlight as needing to perform? Is there a driver who needs to back it? I mean, before you answer that one, we talked about last week about how Valtteri Bottas. This was maybe it might prove to be a significant win in Sochi. Does he? How likely is it? Does he carry? I mean, the momentum's obviously huge, and he's got it now from that win. Does he? How likely is it that he carries it over and picks up maybe what could be another significant win on Sunday? Or do you reckon Hamilton will be able to rebound and get the job done?
Hamilton has a history of rebounding from good runs of teammate form. You need to go back to like the Nico Rosberg era at Mercedes to see that. And at the risk, Valtteri Bottas is a great driver, don't get me wrong, but I think Nico Rosberg is some level ahead of him. He's the only teammate that was really ever able to hold a candle to Lewis Hamilton in terms of consistency. So I would not be surprised to see Hamilton go out and win this weekend. As you've already said, the experience there. Hamilton began his career in 2007. The Nürburgring was a consistent fixture of the timetable until it left the calendar in 2013. I think at least 4 or 5 Grand Prix in that period that Hamilton was racing there, including the absolute mess that was the 2007 race, where it was basically a monsoon at the beginning. So he's raced there in difficult conditions as well. I can definitely see Hamilton doing this weekend. It's the kind of overall balanced circuit that he does very well at, rather than the disgusting mess that is the Sochi Autodrome, which is Valtteri Bottas's hunting ground. So, I mean, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen come race day. I mean, the Italian Grand Prix basically proved that perfectly. But I would still be predicting a Hamilton victory. Not out of the question that Verstappen finishes ahead of Bottas, or at least one of the Mercedes in second, because he is dragging the absolute best out of that Red Bull. But yeah, I mean, basically, it's the same with all race weekends this year. Prediction is that Hamilton wins, but if Bottas does, it's hardly a surprise. Nonetheless, further to what we were saying last week, I don't think it's a massive change to the championship if Bottas manages to pick up one win, considering he's 40 points behind and quite clearly the second driver at Mercedes Petronas this year.
Yeah. I think Hamilton has won at Nürburgring in the past. I remember reading that in researching for the show. So he's done it before.
See how many wins he's got for you.
He's done it before. I mean, the other driver who on the grid who has won at this track previously is Sebastian Vettel. Unfortunately, he's not in a competitive car. He
doesn't care anymore. He just does not care. Just the way he, like, when his brakes failed at the Italian Grand Prix. I don't know if anyone's seen this. Beyond the first chicane at Monza, there's like a chicane of polystyrene blocks that you have to go through. Vettel just drove straight through them. He just doesn't care anymore. He knows he's leaving at the end of the year. He's going to a better team next year in Aston Martin. He doesn't want to be at Ferrari. They quite frankly don't want him anymore. I wouldn't be surprised to see him spin on lap 1 at the Nürburgring, to be honest, despite it being his home Grand Prix.
Yeah, I found it. Hamilton won in 2011 with the McLaren Mercedes while he was driving for McLaren at the time.
Yeah, and when Hamilton was in GP2 before his Formula One debut, he won both the feature race and the sprint race at the Nürburgring. Bearing in mind that if you win the sprint race, if you win the first race in Formula 2, you have to start 8th in the sprint race, which is shorter. So Hamilton was able to start from a good position in GP2 and win, and start from a bad position in GP2, come through the field and win.
Yeah.
Hamilton's going to win, let's be honest.
Well, if he doesn't, we've jinxed him. So so those who are watching, you can just play back the clip for us. It'll be like a receipt, essentially. You mentioned just then the Honda news, and it is right. We bring it up. Honda announced recently, obviously, that they are no longer going to be a constructor in the Formula One sport as a whole. They're pulling back. This obviously, let's focus on the one team it has obvious ramifications for, and that is Red Bull. And I've seen a lot of jokes about how Red Bull could become Red Bull Renault again, which would be, given the way it ended, given the way they switched from Renault to Honda, it was quite a tumultuous one. Where does Red Bull? What? If obviously it's a lot to predict. Where will Red Bull go in terms of going back to maybe a Ferrari engine or so? Do you have any idea what kind of constructor we could see? Maybe they are partnered with Aston Martin. Maybe does Aston Martin then get into the game of providing their own engine for the team? What do you reckon?
See, this has been something that's been in discussion for a long time. Aston Martin providing a dedicated power unit to an F1 team or several customers. Similar to what's going to happen with Renault, actually, because they're obviously rebranding as Alpine next year. There will not be an official Renault team, but they will be supplying the Alpine team. But they will also probably be supplying Red Bull and AlphaTauri as well, because in the sporting regulations, they want to ensure some degree of parity between engine suppliers. From next year, Mercedes will have 4 Mercedes-powered teams on the grid. Ferrari will have 3. There are only 3 teams left, one of which will be Alpine, powered by Renault. The other 2 of the Red Bull empire of Red Bull and AlphaTauri. There aren't any slots available really for Mercedes and Ferrari to give engines to their customer teams, nor would Mercedes have any interest in providing a Mercedes power unit to their closest rivals. So that's not going to happen. It will be, I wouldn't be surprised to see one of the 2 following possibilities. One, they use Renault power units branded as something else, like what they did with Tag Heuer in their last season using Renault power. It was Red Bull Tag Heuer. It was actually a Renault engine before they moved over to Honda. Also, people have said this is unlikely, but they're definitely a team with the financial wherewithal to do it. I wouldn't be surprised to see Red Bull take ownership of some extent of Honda's engine infrastructure, rebrand it as something else, and then use that in their car. So basically continue the Honda engine program. But that's difficult to do considering the Honda engine program is basically entirely Japanese. That would require a massive movement of infrastructure, which is made more difficult in COVID-19 circumstances. So the realistic circumstances that they are going to be using Renault power from next year, which no one will really be happy about, least of all Christian Horner. But to be honest, serves him right for the acrimonious attitude he displayed when separating with Renault in the first place.
Yeah, and you could argue they had the last laugh most recently when Ricciardo left Red Bull for Renault. So, except he won't be there obviously next year.
Yeah,
you mentioned 4 cars on the track will be, or four teams rather, will have Mercedes-powered cars, 3 Ferrari. Are we worried about parity in the sport with the news of Honda going? Are we worried that, I mean, obviously this isn't new, this isn't shocking. Like, we know Mercedes and Ferrari dominate the sport, but are we worried about, say, a third manufacturer who wanted to come in, say the likes of an Audi or a Porsche, or someone wanted to enter the sport? Are we worried about that at all, or is it not something to worry about immediately, like now at least?
Well, Audi's not going to enter the sport because Wolfgang Ehrlich, their motorsport boss, has committed to basically no carbon emitting sport in future. It's one of the many reasons why Audi withdrew their Le Mans program, which was like a diesel hybrid thing. They've got rid of that. They're basically committed to electrics in motorsport now. And it's a similar strategy to what Honda's displaying. Aside from the recession and COVID-19 hit circumstances, that's one of the many reasons why Honda wants to pull out as well. So that's very much the case. It's also why Renault is rebranding as Alpine. They don't really want to be associated with, carbon emissions when they're trying to make themselves carbon neutral, I think, by 2030. No, not carbon neutral, sell an awful lot of electric vehicles. I can't remember what the percentage is by 2030. So they might as well just fob off an underperforming team to a manufacturer that they don't own, Alpine. It is very worrying. I'm not going to lie. I've not that I wish to be nostalgic, because I do genuinely think F1 is improving in a lot of ways. But I still remember the days where there were 6 or 7 engine suppliers on the grid. Granted, some of them were absolutely terrible, but every car in the field, think back 2003. Renault, Ferrari, Williams, BMW, McLaren, Mercedes, they were all powered by different power units. And yeah, there was some discrepancy between them, but it led to one hell of an interesting championship in 2003. We've already seen early in this hybrid era just how unbalanced the engines can be. It has leveled out quite a lot since that very unbalanced Mercedes dominance in 2014. But it is really worrying for me that we're back to just 3 engine suppliers on the grid. We're basically seeing Red Bull being forced back into a Renault partnership, which if it was any other team, quite frankly, I'd feel really sorry for them if they don't want to make it happen. I mean, as we've got new sporting regulations coming in 2022, we don't know how well the power units are going to adapt to that. But yeah, with the exception of a massive manufacturer coming in, of which there aren't many, considering the commitment to electric and low emissions technology in the next 10 years or so, I don't think we're going to see another engine supplier in F1 for at least a couple of years, which is sad.
Yeah, I just found an article that's from May that said there was a new team, there was an aspiring team, Panthera Team Asia, were interested in joining the grid in 2022. Obviously, COVID has maybe thwarted plans slightly, but it'll be interesting to see if they are still interested in joining the sport, and that could be a fresh injection of energy, or it could end up like Lotus that became Caterham and then is now no longer. So
I was going to say there's two ways that this Asian team ownership can go. It can go the Formula E way, where Techeetah dominate 3 seasons in a row, Chinese team, or it will go the way of Lotus, then Caterham, who were Anglo-Malaysian and were pretty damn terrible from the moment they came into the sport. So I think Pantera F1 are probably going to be the new sort of US GP story. Are they going to be on the grid next year? Yeah, sure. They never are.
We'll wait and see. And the other thing, I guess, off the track, we wanted to bring up, obviously, as we mentioned with the NFL, COVID cases have been hitting sports globally, and I think F1 recently they released their numbers of COVID cases, and it's definitely starting to go up on the rise. It's the highest number of positive tests yet. They've had 10 ancillary personnel test positive in the past week. Obviously, F1, as we know, it's a sport that travels, so there's no way of putting it in a bubble environment, nor is there any way of as much as they can, obviously, but there's no way of them sticking to one track and obviously competing 7 races at one track. So is this any pause of concern, or do you reckon because of the nature of the sport, this would have been anticipated and therefore there would have been plans to combat this issue?
I can't speak for an awful lot of the off-track personnel that have tested positive, but the more high-profile cases of personnel surrounding F1 testing positive, i.e. Sergio Perez, the Racing Point driver, who I believe broke some degree of lockdown rules, tested positive a couple of weeks later. So again, that's not really the travelling culture of F1 to blame. And also one of the senior paddock reporters, if you go on the F1 YouTube channel, he's everywhere. Yeah. Will Buxton, love the guy. He tested positive a few weeks ago, but he'd returned home to be with his family for a few weeks when there was a short break in this very condensed season. Obviously, you'll let him do that, but he tested positive, self-isolated, did whatever he can. Again, that's not really the travelling nature of F1. It's actually done pretty well in terms of containing the amount of cases for a sport that is so international. Granted, it's become a lot more European, if you look at the schedule this year, relative to what Liberty have tried to do. But yeah, I don't see it absolutely kiboshing the season like it could well do with the NFL. Obviously, there's cause for concern. It's a global pandemic. We've got to. But, the season's coming towards an end. And I'm sure we're going to be covering F1 more in the weeks to come. But I've actually been very impressed by how this season's been put on.
Yeah, I think they've done a really good job at kind of pivoting and finding a way and bringing back tracks like Nürburgring, which we haven't seen in a while.
Almost makes you wonder why they can't put these tracks on the calendar in regular circumstances, despite the fact that everyone wants them there. People have been calling for Turkey to come back for like 10 years. It's coming back. Imola, first ever race at Mugello, Nürburgring. We've managed to get them all on the calendar. One of my favourite tracks, Algarve in Portugal. That's on the calendar for the first ever time. It's not quite as difficult as people might like you to believe that it is.
Hey, that's a question for Stefano Domenicali when he takes over in a couple of weeks. We also got the Portuguese Grand Prix, which should be an interesting one.
I can't wait for that.
As you mentioned. But until then, we will definitely, as you said, we will cover Formula One throughout this term. But it is now 4. We're going to probably call it there. Don't forget, on Saturday from 3 to 5, Quarant Stream's we're renewed for season 2. We've been called back for season 2. It's an international break, so we will find a way to talk about some stuff. Probably talk a bit about deadline day. Probably talk a bit about the Champions League draw, maybe looking at the groups that kind of got formed. Joe will have a lot to say about AS Roma because they were very busy on that deadline day by just about minutes getting a deal over the line. But yeah, we will definitely So that will be. For those who are keen on football, please join us then. We will have a fun show, 2 hours chatting. Of course, we'll talk a bit about England, about the home nations, and some notable European nations as well. But for now, and this show will be back in 2 weeks because next week we'll have an interview we will announce in due course, fingers crossed. But for now, thank you, Joe Spagnoli, for joining me as per usual. We will be back on Saturday from 3 to 5. And quick housekeeping, all the links to our socials are in the video description. So feel free to join that, as well as the Raw Sport group, where you can get all the requests to join us on these shows. We're always looking for new voices, and they would be much appreciated. So thank you for watching, and we'll be back on Saturday.